Hello. There is a grim truth that I must confess to before we begin. I wouldn't be in the reviewing game without the likes of CinemaSins, or far, far darker still, the Nostalgia Critic. Both are comedy channels on YouTube that I watched endlessly as a teenager. Not because I found them funny, but because they were full of spoilers for things that I'd never watched but wanted to get the gist of. When I got into book reviews, I kinda wanted to provide something similar to what I got out of those channels. CinemaSins isn't well regarded these days. It offers arbitrary critique based on a rubric of sin or not sin. It often misses the points of the films it's covering entirely. However, CinemaSins is supposed to be comedy, it's a bit. As much as I don't care for them, I feel like I've sometimes seen people swing way too hard against them for their poor media analysis skills, when providing a highbrow review was never the point of their channel. It was a joke that got successful, and the creators are presumably just locked into it forever now. This is to say that when I picked up The Ables by CinemaSins co-creator Jeremy Scott, when I picked it up for its review, I was one of the few people in my Discord going, I never had anything against CinemaSins, and maybe the book is okay. With its unexpected, well-intentioned topic, lower age range, and self-published nature, The Ables seemed like it was a passion project. Maybe behind CinemaSins was someone with genuine ideas and passion who was just stuck married to an unfunny bit. I wound up abandoning this goodwill before the end of chapter 1. The Ables is a superhero story about disabled kids proving themselves as heroes when everyone else doubts them. The book is YA, but it does aim for the younger side of YA, with most of the cast being 12 or 13. While the story sounds very basic, it kind of could be an after-school special, that doesn't mean it couldn't be well executed. Disabled children do deserve more stories about characters like them. Disabled kids do not deserve, however, the Ables. It becomes rapidly clear early on that Jeremy Scott did not do proper research on, any of the disabilities he portrayed in this book. I do not believe that he spoke to a blind person before he made his lead blind. And I think as much as he might have Googled what ataxic cerebral palsy is, he definitely didn't bother learning anything about Down syndrome. The result is that this book about misfit kids being dismissed for being too disabled, proving that they can save the day, appears to despise the disabled, and it reinforces the idea that the disabled are inherently less than their peers unless they overcome the inherent suffering of being disabled. It's easy to imagine the correct way to write a story like this. The kids would face obstacles because of their disabilities, but also show off unique strengths and knowledge. Instead, these kids hate being disabled, fail at every step, and the main character only makes progress into competence by being cured of his blindness. Disability is a complex topic because it's a very broad one. I'm an advocate for the idea of a half-death of the author. Fiction should function without the need for a biography because this is how the majority of people are likely to experience the work. However, the context gained from knowing the author is often valuable, and in cases like discussing disability, it adds much-needed insight. One of the first things I did before reading The Ables was, for once, look into Jeremy Scott and his relationship to disability. In an article for the Columbia Chronicle, Jeremy mentions the lack of representation for disabled characters, his hopes for the series, and his own disabilities. So, this is an excerpt from the article. Scott, who is 50% deaf in both his ears and has anxiety and depression, said there is a lot of himself reflected in his characters and story. And that's from a Columbia Chronicle article from 2019. Disabled people, like any marginalized group, often have stories written about them by people who lack knowledge on the actual lived experiences of being disabled. Even if Jeremy doesn't share any disabilities with the cast of his novel, he still has had lived experience of being disabled. I will not deny him that. However, his lack of experience with the disabilities he depicts is obvious. In an interview with Tam magazine, he asked if writing a blind first-person perspective was a challenge. And this is his response when asked about this. The challenge of that was sort of why I did it. I thought that while I am sure I'm not the only author to ever write in the first-person perspective of a blind person, the idea is definitely unique. I thought it would be interesting to try to tell the story using either visuals from other people or Philip's other senses. It was tough. There were definitely times where I couldn't do what I wanted to do in terms of my original plan, but I think the book is better for it. This is from Tam Magazine, an interview of Jeremy Scott from 2015. What stands out in what I've read is that there's no mention of research or consultation. Jeremy describes writing from a first-person blind perspective as hard, but I can find no evidence he ever asked a blind person for help or watched a video on the subject. Jeremy's own experiences with hearing loss and mental health conditions may offer insight to the othering experiences of being disabled, but it cannot provide accuracy and authenticity for being blind. Disabled people need more representation, but it isn't representation if it's an outsider closing their eyes and imagining very hard. I don't know for certain Jeremy didn't consult anybody while writing this book, but I will confidently say, as someone who's read the book, if he did, he didn't take anything he learned to heart. As much as Jeremy failed to do the bare minimum when it came to research, it's true that research is hard. It's a skill, one undertaught in school, and increasingly difficult in the age of generative AI misinformation. Knowing how to find reliable, accurate information from first-hand sources is important, whether you're a writer, artist, essayist, and that's where today's sponsor Skillshare can help. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, and creatives there doesn't just mean artists. There's classes on programming, marketing, cooking, interior design, and research. Just browsing the thousands of classes can be intimidating because there's just so much cool stuff out there to learn. Luckily, Skillshare has curated learning paths, which make it easy to pick a skill you've always wanted to try out and learn exactly how to actually do it. I've been consumed by a new hyperfixation lately. It's led me to start a webcomic, weirdly enough, and I've never done anything like this before. And as much fun as experimenting is, I've realized I'm not very good at understanding what makes for effective typography and font choice. So I've been enjoying classes like this one by Caroline Oceani to build up that knowledge. There's a ton of other courses I've been enjoying too, relating to like my YouTube career, my hobbies, my flatmates' hobbies, or just because I'm curious. The first 500 people who use the link in the description of this video will get a free month-long trial of Skillshare, and the just countless hours of classes that includes. Learn something new, check out that link, and thank you again Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Back to the main event, disaster, we'll see. It's also worth mentioning, before we go any further into the plot of this book, that I myself am disabled. Most notable is a chronic condition which only developed a few years ago. I understand the hesitation to insert too much of yourself into a book, but it makes me think how much better the Ables might have been if Jeremy had used his progressive hearing loss as the main character's disability instead of blindness. The feeling of changing for the worse, trying to accept yourself as disabled while also acknowledging it sucks and, again, potentially could be getting worse. The progressive othering from the able-body existence, it's a very interesting perspective that it sounds like Jeremy might know something about and could have used in his novel. I would be interested in that because I would be able to relate to some of those experiences potentially. However, this wasn't the case. Before we begin, a note about this book. This book is about ableism, but also it is heavily ableist, as I've already alluded to. There is going to be a lot of discussion of mistreatment of the disabled, and in particular, the way that Down syndrome and people with learning disabilities are portrayed in this book is honestly quite upsetting. So keep that in mind before watching the rest of the video. Thank you. Plot. Philip Salinger is 12 when he learns he's a superhero. The Ables is a deeply earnest book with prose that speaks of a lack of writing experience and bland writing in general. It's more evocative of a script than a novel. The initial premise of the first chapter is Philip being taken by his dad to a cornfield, where his dad explains he'll be coming of age and to his powers soon. This conversation lasts for 2 chapters, rolling on and on with nothing going on but exposition and awkward family chit-chat. It is immediately clear an editor has not really touched this book. If they have, I mean, there's somebody listed in the credits, they were not a very dedicated one. The joke of the scene is that Philip thinks his dad is going to give him the sex talk, and this comedic concept is so outrageous it is hammered in again and again. And here's an example of some of the prose of this book. You thought I wanted to talk to you about sex? He asked, spurting and choking each word through his guffaws. That's the most hilarious thing I've ever heard, he gasped. Oh dear, no! His laughter was still growing stronger. The last thing I want to talk to you about is sex. Page 9. Just the same text reiterated again and again. The point, and this is the case for most of the writing in the book, stated again and again. We learn a large amount of lore up front, though there will be plenty more late additions. Superheroes are called custodians. I'm gonna call them superheroes throughout this entire review, but they're called custodians in universe. They exist as a secret society enforced vaguely through memory-controlling powers. There's a few hero-only towns, such as Freepoint, where Philip's family has just moved. Superheroes fight supervillains, of course, with Philip's dad saying more than half of heroes are good and some of them are neutral. His wording accidentally implies that, 45% of people with superpowers become evil. And I'd probably reconsider my society if so many people immediately left it to go on to do crime. So, superhero powers are genetic, and they can be determined from birth with modern technology. It often runs in families, but rarely parent to child directly. There's over 2,000 known powers, but when a new DNA sequence shows up, there's no way to identify what it might be until the kid grows up. It just sort of is one of those, the science just works, okay, guys? Some powers are great, like borrowing abilities from others or teleporting across the world. A number of powers are simply high intelligence or exceptional hand-eye coordination. There are only a few thousand powered people on Earth, and Philip has inherited his father's ability of telekinesis. Unfortunately, telekinesis only works through visualization, and Philip has been blind his entire life. His dad explains how he uses his powers by looking at an object, getting a feel for its dimensions and weight, and imagining it move. As much as Philip can't do this, he can still study an object by feel and knowledge by putting it in his hand. He's just limited on things that are away from him. He's able to access his powers, but it's a difficult process for him. Philip also has a younger brother named Patrick, and his dad reveals his brother also has powers, super speed. However, his brother isn't allowed to know superheroes are real until he's 13, so it has to be a secret. While discussing this, Philip uses an ableist slur to casually describe his brother. His dad says it's not a nice word, and Philip uses it again immediately internally. The word in question is one which is only offensive in the UK. I grew up thinking it was a rude playground-level insult. I showed it to my English flatmate, and I received absolute shock. It's on tier with the R word here. As much as it's realistic for Philip to not be aware of this and use it as a light dig against his brother, it feels like Jeremy simply didn't know or think to look into this word at all. His book about inspiring disabled kids opens near immediately with an ableist slur used casually and jokingly by the lead. Philip starts at his new school. Everyone here is a superhero, most of them having just learned superheroes are real. He's excited, he's given even a GPS audio navigator to guide him to his classes, help him avoid obstacles, only to learn he's been put in the special education class. Here's his reaction to it. I could not believe that I was in a special education classroom. I was confused and angry. I had never felt so insulted in my short life. I was blind, not disabled. There's a difference. Except for the fact I actually was disabled. Blindness is a disability, whether I wanted to acknowledge it or not. I spent a lot of my early years denying that blindness even made me different at all. But did my particular disability mean I needed specialized learning? Surely it wasn't one that belonged grouped together with kids in wheelchairs, right? Page 31. Philip here is touching very directly on internalized ableism, though neither he nor the book ever really moves past the perspective that disabled people are lacking compared to the able-bodied. He notes he was in standard classes at his last school, and he didn't even have a personal navigator back then. For the curious, there's one mention of Philip using a collapsible cane, singular, one mention, but otherwise he doesn't use any sort of aids. It turns out that every disabled kid in school has been sequestered to the special education classroom. And I mean every disabled kid. Special ed is, in general terms, for people who struggle to learn in a standardized school environment and require accommodation. In the United States, where the book takes place, the 1975 Disabilities Education Act requires free, equal education based on individual needs to disabled students. Special ed classes are common, but there is meant to be some effort towards inclusion rather than squirreling them away in a corner. The execution of this obviously varies wildly. Sometimes special education can work out well for some people, and in some cases it is kind of a neglectful hellhole. Someone whose sole disability requires wheelchair use does not need to be in a special ed class, because the only learning obstacles they're likely to face are stairs and maybe desks, things that the school must accommodate for. Being blind may change how some things are taught or conveyed, but it is something that can be accommodated for with relative ease depending on the class. There's a deaf girl in the special education class, but she specifically has an interpreter who translates to and for her. One of the kids is a super genius with cerebral palsy. He just uses a cane. Another kid has asthma. Canon also finds the act of putting every disabled kid in the same room ridiculous, yet as much as the students dislike this, and the central plot is about the town further discriminating against them, it's never brought up as something that needs to be changed. The further discrimination is something they do challenge. The idea that they should be locked away is not. Their one teacher is Mrs. Crouch, a woman whose first introduction is so unpleasant, I assumed she was a villain. I absolutely despise this woman. She has 3 major scenes or so, and you will come to despise her too. She is meant to be a wise mentor, I'm pretty sure. She is not. So in the following scene that I'm going to read, Philip has arrived late on his first day of class, and he's distracted when he hears his name being called. He assumes it's roll call, and he says, "Here," only to hear laughter. "Well," said the woman, "I'm certainly glad that you're here, and we welcome you here, but that's not what I asked." "I'm sorry, ma'am," I offered meekly. "I was distracted. I didn't hear your question." "When exactly did you tune out, then? Did you manage to hear any of what I said?" I felt as though I was shrinking a bit. "No, ma'am. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, Mr. Salinger." She sounded sincere, like she meant it. "It's the first day of school, so I understand if some of you are a little distracted." She sounded old, maybe a little cranky, and had a hint of a German accent. "But we weren't just taking roll. There were only 8 of you in here. We can generally take roll just by looking. Plus, the entire class was present when you came in tardy a few moments ago. Calling out everyone's names to have them audibly respond would be a horrible waste of our precious time together. No, we want to know more about you." Page 31. Excuse me? Philip doesn't know that there's only 8 people in here. It might be beneficial to take roll so he and the other blind kid can learn where people are sat and their voices. He wasn't the only tardy kid, having arrived with someone else. He's 12. It's the first day of class. He just moved to town. He's blind. And she continues on, being even more condescending somehow. "We want to know not only about your interests and your hobbies, but also your powers and your disability. You see, Mr. Salinger, everyone in this room has a unique combination of ability and disability." I wouldn't say that she was speaking slowly, but she was definitely not in a hurry. "Some might say this creates special challenges for you, hurdles for you to overcome. And that's probably true. Others, myself included, would suggest that maybe it also offers you special opportunities that most students within these walls will never have," she continued. "But we'll never know what those possibilities are until we get to know one another and get comfortable with one another. So, Philip, why don't you kick things off as I had originally intended?" Page 32. These kids are 12, I'm going to be saying that a lot, with only one of them having a learning disability. But the teacher Crouch here talks to them as if they somehow don't know they're disabled. No one should be made to disclose the nature of their disability like this anyways, and it's worth noting that those special opportunities she alludes to never manifest. At every step, this book shows disability to be exclusively a hurdle. After this, we get to meet the cast one by one. There's quite a lot of characters in the main cast, but very little to say about them beyond their disability and superpower. They mostly read the same personality-wise, and most of them are barely mentioned again after this scene, so don't worry too much about all of these names. So, starting with Henry. Henry was born without use of his legs and is in a wheelchair. His power is mind reading, and he's meant to be sarcastic, I think. Bentley has ataxic cerebral palsy, which gives him poor balance and coordination. He's a super genius and exists as the team's MacGuffin factory, hacking and solving whatever problem with ease and technology. James is also blind, having lost his sight in a lab accident when he was young. He's a teleporter, and he runs his own business ferrying people around with his powers. These are the names you'll see the most often, beyond Donnie, who is going to be discussed last for reasons which will become obvious. There's also Freddy. He has asthma, and he can grow up to 3 stories tall in an instant. However, the rapid expansion always triggers his asthma, meaning he can't remain big for longer than a few seconds without collapsing. Penelope has a deadly aversion to sunlight, a condition never specified, but by details, it's likely something called xeroderma pigmentosum. I might have slightly flubbed that. She can control the weather. Delilah is entirely deaf, but has inherited the gene for superhearing. She has no access and no hope of access to her superpower, making her essentially a regular deaf girl. It feels actively cruel to force her to attend a superhero school where she's a minority for being disabled, and for being the only student who has no superpowers. Lastly, there is Donnie. And oh boy. Donnie has Down syndrome. First, a language note. All disabilities have different ways of referring to them, and terminology has changed over time. The book and I will be using Down syndrome, as most advocacy groups prefer, but there are those who use other variations. As with most things, the important thing is to listen to what language a person prefers to use for themselves, and use that. Second, I am surprised that the book uses the preferred term for Down syndrome, because that is one of the only things it gets correct about it. Here's Donnie's introduction, by his aide. Donnie has Down syndrome, she said, which means that he kind of has the mind of a young child in the body of a grown man. He may look like a young man in his early 20s, but he's just 15 years old. You could tell in her voice that Rebecca cared about Donnie very much. Donnie is very friendly and lovable and is just a big teddy bear. Feel free to be friendly with him. He really enjoys company. He's kind of quiet, but he is listening. Page 33. Rebecca, the aide here, like Crouch, can't help but infantilize this disabled child, while also repeating comparisons to him being an adult and completely failing to explain what Down syndrome is at all. Her description actually frightens Philip. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit scared of Donnie. I'm not sure why, but I was wary. I'd never met anyone with Down syndrome before, but I was pretty sure a 15-year-old in the body of a 25-year-old was something worth being afraid of. Page 34. Everything about how Donnie is written is a red flag, brighter than a red flag, that Jeremy Simpsons doesn't really know what Down syndrome is. I don't have much personal knowledge of Down syndrome myself, but I do have access to, believe it or not, the internet, so I could get any information. Down syndrome occurs when a person is born with a full or partial copy of chromosome 21. It changes how the body develops. Most people with Down syndrome share certain characteristics, but everyone is unique, and the degree to which they have these common traits varies. For example, people with Down syndrome usually do have a learning disability, but the way that it affects them varies. Donnie is repeatedly called huge, apparently an adult at 15, with notable brute strength repeatedly called out. Among some of the most common traits linked to Down syndrome are a short stature, stocky build, and slow muscle development. The average height for an adult with Down syndrome is 5 feet, and Donnie is well over 6 feet, it seems. Donnie's powers aren't known yet because his Down syndrome has scrambled his genetic markers so they can't be properly read. He is mostly silent and occasionally softly vocalizes. Though he does go on to become important, Donnie is never treated as more than a tame animal by the narrative. Multiple characters are shocked that he is capable of understanding speech or capable of thinking. Later in the book, Philip doubts if Donnie has free will. Granted, any of us could be hurt during the SuperSim, but it wasn't quite the same with Donnie. I wasn't sure he had the same measure of free will that we did. He was participating as an extension of his loyalty to us, not because he wanted to play superhero or even understood what it was. He just wanted to belong. Page 86. The stuff about Donnie only gets worse, but we'll get there. It is mind-boggling that Jeremy Cinemasins could sit down to write a book about uplifting disabled children and then write a disabled child like Donnie, who is only a tool for the narrative, written from incorrect ideas of his disability and utterly defined by it. Who, of course, dies at the end. Are kids with Down syndrome not worth empowering, worth portraying honestly? As much as this book fails at its goals for every character, Donnie's treatment is especially hideous. Looking at the disabled kids as a whole, there's a few things that stand out. One is the choices made regarding their disabilities and what is and isn't said about them. Philip is blind, but blindness is not a singular condition. Most people who are blind do not have total absence of visual input and may perceive lights, colors, and blurs. It's quite rare for someone to be born entirely blind like Philip. There's nothing wrong with Philip having a rare version of blindness, but it does stand out that he's conforming to the most stereotypical idea of what blindness is. Blindness is something caused by a variety of conditions, but Philip's blindness is never specified. And something important to writing good representation is to write accurate representation. Philip's blindness is not from any specific condition and is perfectly generic in how it functions. Similarly, there's Henry. He was born without use of his legs. There's a lot of conditions which could cause this, but his is not specified. The common idea of a wheelchair user is Henry. Many wheelchair users may be capable of standing or even walking, and the idea that using a wheelchair means you have to have total paralysis often leads to wheelchair users being harassed when they don't conform to that idea. Like Philip, there's nothing wrong with Henry being this way, but it similarly reinforces the most stereotypical view of his disability. And this goes on. Delilah was born entirely deaf when that is quite rare, but it is how deaf people are typically portrayed in media. Penelope seemingly has XP, a disease so uncommon it beats the rare disease quota, which is 1 in 2,000 people, and incurs instead at a rate of 1 in 1 million. Bentley has ataxic cerebral palsy, the rarest type, which manifests typically as shaky movement, difficulty with fine motor controls, poor depth perception, often a speech impediment of some kind. Bentley uses a cane and exhibits no other symptoms, spending most of his time fine-tuning small robotic inventions. With all of these, the issue is not that people cannot be this way. It's that the author could not look further than the basic ideas of disability and what was easier to write. Inching the plot forward, Philip's first day of school continues. He heads to lunch, and the editor is apparently asleep because we do get this. The table itself was long and rectangular with benches attached, like an extra-large picnic table. It seemed like every other lunchroom table I'd ever known, with a hard formica surface. Page 38. The book is full of sentences like this, infuriatingly bland descriptions which add nothing, usually rehash the obvious, and leave the reader slightly puzzled. Why does the 12-year-old blind kid know what formica is? Do you know what formica is? Because it's a brand of plastic coating. Or plastic tables, sort of. I barely know what it is when I looked it up. But, he can identify it by touch. Philip is approached by two bullies, of course named Chad and Steve, who pretend to be friendly in order to play a prank. It's not subtle that they're actually picking on Philip, but the book breaks the tension several times to just inform you anyways. Here's a scene of the bullying. I'm a telekinetic, actually. I probably sounded a little too proud. I paused then, expecting Chad and Steve to be every bit as impressed as my classmates had been. And they were. Steve whistled, you know, that high-pitched whistle people do when they're impressed. And then Chad said, "Wow, that's a pretty cool power, man." "No kidding, dude," Steve concurred. "You don't see too many telekinetics, do you?" "No," Chad agreed, "you certainly don't." Their chemistry was amazing, and I was buying it hook, line, and sinker. Page 37. Their chemistry was amazing. It's just such a funny example of telling instead of showing, because their chemistry is not. That even in that excerpt, I hope you can get the idea, but it's such a long scene, and to just cap it out like, by the way, this chemistry, off the charts. It does make me laugh, actually, every time. The bullies ask Philip to demonstrate his power using his phone, but he can't access his abilities. They laugh, and Chad smashes the phone and then claims Philip did by accident. I know that they're just generic older bullies named Chad and Steve, but it's such an extreme move to walk up to a 12-year-old blind boy you've never met and just smash his phone as a prank. They scamper off as the other disabled kids arrive, including Donnie, who everyone fears. Donnie's massive size and frightening nature are further hammered in. "Besides," added Bentley, "whatever his powers are, he's definitely super strong. Even regular humans with Down syndrome are strong. That's what my brother says." "I know you haven't seen him, really, but Donnie's a giant. He's like 6 feet tall. He's bigger than most of the teachers here." As if I needed more reasons to be wary of Donnie. Page 43. Bentley's source might be something his older brother told him, but it's never challenged and is treated repeatedly as fact. This is just how Down syndrome works. It's not. The kids explain to Philip that the school has a no power zone, or NPZ. In effect, these fields nullify superpowers, and they're generated by people with a very rare power. Their superpower is generating no power zones. The fact Philip was not told at any point before this about the NPZ is kind of ludicrous if it's in effect all across the school. After lunch, we get a lot of long exposition breaks again. The world building in the Ables is puzzling at best, a symptom of the extremely poor writing that plagues the book throughout. As much as some of it, like Superheroes Remaining Secret, is part of the genre, its efforts to be unique are what fail the hardest. Philip asks about the Believers to Mrs. Crouch, stating he's heard about them in passing. It's the first time they're referenced in the book. She gives an extremely long explanation, so I have to truncate it a lot, but also I do promise I'm not skipping any important details. Everything I've cut out is basically just rehashing the thing that was said the sentence before. "A very long time ago," she said haltingly, "before biblical times, there is a story of an empowered man who had all the powers and abilities in one. In the more modern texts, he's called Elbin. Elbin was the leader of the Haladites, an ancient army of evil that spread over 2/3 of the earth before they were defeated." "How were they defeated?" Freddie asked. "By perhaps the most famous group of custodians in history, an outfit known as the Ables. They were, quite literally, the only good-hearted 6 custodians left standing in the wake of Elbin's march across Europe. Convinced Elbin's abilities posed a permanent threat to the entire planet's population, they executed him right then and there, in a place we now refer to as the Bleeding Grounds." Page 50. Okay. Pause. I don't know. Can we even pause that? Also, I don't know if I can do this late, but you know, an outfit known as the Ables. Roll credits! Look, there's too much to talk about, and there are no answers. The benchmark of before biblical times is so bizarre, and earlier in the chapter, we also get a mention of documents far older than the Bible. Human civilization is like 10,000 years old, depending on how you define it. And biblical times usually refers to what we'd call before Common Era, about 2,000 years ago. A public school teacher shouldn't be referring to history in biblical terms to begin with, but it's not like invoking the Bible is making her lesson any clearer. Crouch is explaining that in an unknown land at an unknown time, some guy named Elbin was evil for some reason, and 6 heroes inexplicably named the Ables saved the day. Where are the Bleeding Grounds? Who knows? But Europe is there somehow, as is 2/3 of the planet. Crouch continues. So, children, believers is a word used to describe modern-day custodians who are part of a kind of order, an almost religious group that not only believes the old world stories are true, but also believes he's coming back. In some of our texts, some of the oldest ones, there are prophecies, and one such prophecy suggests, according to some interpretations, not all, that the one who can do it all will return. That one day, the world will see another custodian with all the powers at once. The believers treat this prophecy the way Christians treat the Bible, or Muslims treat the Quran. They treat it like a religion. You mean they worship this Elbin guy? The guy that might come back? Page 51. I know that the cast are children. None of them age actually from 12, despite the plot taking place over more than a year. But sometimes they seem to be half their age, and sometimes they seem to be twice their age. I kind of refuse to believe that a 12-year-old needs this much explanation about such a simple topic. You see, believers believe, like how religions believe. They treat this belief like a religion, these believers, and believe Elbin will return. When Elbin returns, he will be back. The believers believe this. The Ables as a book, it exists on a very strange time scale. While every chapter is exceedingly dry and slow, after the first few concurrent chapters, the rest take place over various length time skips. In many of these time skips, characters will learn something new, plan something secret, or achieve something entirely off-page. Large sections of progress aren't montaged so much as entirely skipped or referenced in just sort of like, and then we did this, this, and this. And that stuff only gets worse the deeper into the book you get. Still in part 1, Philip and co. learn about the upcoming SuperSim. This is what the plot really is about. It's a school competition. For the first time in 20 years, Freepoint High is bringing back the SuperSim, a series of days where kids in teams simulate real crime-fighting experience across the city, scoring points for stopping fake criminals and potentially earning a cool trophy. The existence of superheroes is a secret to civilians and young children. Freepoint, a town of 6,000 people with a population of 2,000 superheroes, is somehow able to hide this huge public spectacle from both travelers and a lot of their own population, but don't worry about it. The SuperSim allows teams of up to 7, and Philip immediately forms a team with Henry, Bentley, James, Freddie, and Donnie. They consider having a 7th person to top it all off. For those with a good memory, there are a total of 8 kids in the special ed class, and the only 2 not included in the SuperSim team are the girls. This book is misogynistic, and it's misogynistic in the most Hollywood standard of ways. Penelope appears in one scene later on and has no dialogue. Delilah does not appear after her first scene, though a character who is probably her named Darla is referenced 2 more times off-page. Beyond changing name, Delilah also gains a new disability the second time she is referenced, now apparently being blind and deaf, because that girl cannot catch a break. Furthering this trend, Delilah's interpreter, a woman named Mary, does not occur after her first scene. Neither does Donnie's aide, a woman named Rebecca. The only consistent women are Mrs. Crouch and Philip's mother. Philip's mother dies, basically twice, purely to serve as plot motivation. As excited as Philip is for the SuperSim, his friends doubt they'll be any good at it because of their disabilities. They then learn that this doesn't matter because they're banned from participating due to being disabled. This puts them in low spirits, but they decide that they're going to challenge the school board and claim discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. In the meantime, the kids become friends and they have a sleepover at Bentley's mansion. It is increasingly obvious how little consideration there is for Philip's life as a blind person and what that would realistically look like. Here's a description from the sleepover. The floors in the kitchen were made of marble or some kind of expensive stone, and the furniture was all made out of leather. There was a gigantic movie screen on the wall that everyone gushed about, and 3 full rows of plush theater seats. They even had cup holders on the armrest. The game room had a pool table, a ping pong table, and even a few old stand-up arcade games. I wanted to live there forever. Page 75. Philip is able to recognize marble or some kind of expensive stone by sound alone. The first sentence also accidentally implies only the kitchen is full of leather furniture, which is just sort of a minor typo error kind of thing, but also like, imagine a leather fridge. He's excited about the theater, the pool table, the ping pong, the arcade games. He wants to live here forever. He also cannot play pool or ping pong or any of the games. A paragraph later, he even admits that he and James, the other blind kid, just sat around while the others played. It's similar to this later remark. The in-person's Jack's experience was even better than the food. They had amazing breadsticks with zesty, cheesy dipping sauce, as well as a wall of video games. It was kid heaven. Page 155. The only better in-person Jack's experience that isn't food-related listed here are the video games, which Philip is suggested to play, but we never actually see. The thing is, blind people can play video games. They can play pool. Blind ping pong is actually a huge sport. Usually games like this need to be adapted for the blind, but someone could train themselves without having any additional adaptions. Philip could be into all of this stuff, but every suggestion is that he's only excited because it's the kind of thing kids like. Nothing to do if he enjoys them or can take part. As of so many issues in this book, the fix is incredibly obvious and never taken. It'd be good color to have Philip mention he got into ping pong after watching the Paralympics, or was such a fan of a particular arcade game he learned all of the sound cues to win despite not having any sight. Instead, Kid Heaven seems to be a place which relies on vision, and Philip seems to be stuck outside the gates. Similarly, there's Philip's love of comic books. Braille comics do exist, but are rare and have never been particularly commercialized. When you see comics adapted for the visually impaired, it's often in an audio format or a script rather than a straight Braille adaptation panel by panel. Consider how variable comic book pages are in the arrangement of text and images. Yet Philip apparently reads his Killing Joke adaptation panel by panel. He also loves televisions and movies, but there's never a mention of him using audio description to follow visual action. These are all sorts of small things that would add some realism and honesty to the depiction of somebody living while being blind that simply don't appear to have been thought of. At the sleepover, the group discusses their abilities and laments the lack of mobility in their team. When Donnie laughs at a joke, they suddenly realize he might be a human who can understand language, much to the group's shock. Yes, I nearly soiled my pants when Donnie answered verbally. I had only ever heard him say yes or no a few times in school, and then it was only to his teacher's aid, and almost always at inappropriate times, like in the middle of the teacher's lecture. But answering questions and speaking conversationally? This was a stunning development, and I gasped out loud before slapping my right hand over my mouth. Page 83. You know, since Henry is a mind reader, you'd think they'd be more aware Donnie is capable of thought. The only implication about this never coming up is either that Henry never tries, or that Donnie's thoughts are somehow illegible due to his disability. They ask Donnie if he can run fast, and he gets up to demonstrate by running outside the house. People have to chase him and get him to stop, but it turns out he can run really, really fast. It turns out later that his superpower is super speed. The kids continue to prep for the SuperSim and their appeal to the school board in being allowed to participate. It's explained why disabled children are universally banned, as apparently 20 years ago, a blind kid who could fly was taking part. He crashed into a kid who could also fly, who had been distracted surveying the area. They both fell from the air and died. It's quite obvious that this is an accident, and one the blind hero wasn't all that responsible for either. I mean, the other kid was entirely distracted. This doesn't matter to the superhero community, though, who immediately labeled all disabilities as too dangerous to take part. Also, while we're here, Philip continues to be casually quite ableist towards his friends, as he says this line at one point, and it really, really irritated me. Henry wasn't much for expending unnecessary effort, and I guess I wouldn't be either if I were in a wheelchair. Page 90. You would expect the arc of this book to feature any personal growth or reflections from Philip on his obvious internalized ableism, but no. And here, about a third way through the book, the messaging just gets so much worse, because this is when Philip gains the ability to see. The boys are hanging out discussing their powers, and talk about Henry's mind-reading abilities. He can only pick up on fully formed thoughts in the form of sentences or clear pictures. Bentley asks if Henry can put images into other people's heads, and they realize he can, and that this can be used to give Philip vision. Henry can look at something and then project what he sees to Philip. Now, here's a note about how blindness works. When I was looking into if Jeremy's CinemaSins had ever used sensitivity readers, I found a review of the Ables on gameofnerds.com by someone called ZeldaWolf2000. The author of the article is blind, a perspective I desperately wanted to hear from when evaluating this book, and their review is worth a read. I'll put a link in the description. I'm going to quote part of it. Something very important sighted readers need to understand is that when you are born completely blind or go blind very early in life, you have no perception of anything. You don't see darkness, you see nothing. It's like trying to see through the back of your head. There's nothing to be visualized. For most people, their brains forget everything about vision because it's a waste of energy and brain space. Which is from their review from 2023. Philip might be capable of processing images in theory with experience, but this is not something as simple as just flipping a switch. To go from no context of visualization to full vision would be a radical, disorienting change Philip would need to adapt to. I mean, imagine the motion sickness alone, especially when the vision is coming from Henry's point of view. But even ignoring Philip's lack of a blistering headache, the problem with this choice is obvious. The book has cured Philip's disability only a short way in. For the rest of the book, Philip almost always has sight, and him having sight is crucial for him being an effective hero who saves the day. And again, ZeldaWolf2000 says it best. All of this adds to my annoyance at this book because I was very excited to see a blind kid with superpowers fight, which is not something you see very often. What makes it worse, though, is that, for some reason, I expected this to happen without any magical cures. Philip would just be a kid who was blind like me, who learned to use his telekinesis to fight in his way, just like how blind people in real life have to adapt in their own way. It may not be what sighted people do. Yeah, we may not be able to do things as quickly as others, and we may need help every once in a while, but that doesn't mean we can't do things. Everyone has something they can't do, it's just ours may be more obvious. From their review again. Because, yes, exactly. This is a novel that is supposed to inspire disabled tweens, basically, and it instead hinges on a magic fix. I don't really have anything against Philip gaining some ability to see with Henry's help. In concept, it's good to see creative uses of superpowers, and it's a nice idea that the team might be able to help cover for each other with their abilities, working together in some way. However, this is also the only such collab. Henry from now on becomes Philip's seeing eye boy, ever present and increasingly dedicated purely to giving Philip the best eyesight possible. At no point does Philip, use his telekinesis to move a branch out of Henry's path, or lift his chair over a curb or whatever. At no point does this feel reciprocal. Henry becomes increasingly skilled at projecting live vision to Philip, but it requires constant effort on his part, effort that is unaddressed and feels more like an unequal obligation. At this stage, Henry hasn't mastered the ability and can only project still, vague images. It's more an exciting possibility, but they will become rapidly good at it and Philip will basically have perfect eyesight rather quickly. Just not yet. First, we have to cover the big school board meeting. 1/6 of the town's population has turned up in the audience, that is 1,000 people. And Bentley begins with an opening statement, pointing out that it's illegal and immoral to ban disabled students from participation in the SuperSim. The audience is immediately on his side and claps enthusiastically. The president of the school board, named Tucker, corrects him. Even if we wanted to, he says in mock innocence that even I could detect, we would not be permitted to bring the matters of U.S. national law into consideration in these proceedings. We are only permitted to interpret the laws that govern superpowered individuals, and those laws supersede all else. Page 112. Apparently, the fact that these superheroes, they don't obey American law, never came up in any of the research or planning that the kids did. And so their claim of discrimination based on the Americans with Disabilities Act is immediately tossed out. Whatever laws the superhero community observes, they have actively chosen to not protect the disabled. I guess this explains why a kid with asthma was put in special education. It makes you wonder what other important laws the superhero community is just choosing to ignore. These books take place in the modern era with superheroes living all across the globe, and none of them apparently ever went, maybe we should care about civil rights, human rights, equality. Tucker further states, now, removing the illegality of the matter from the discussion, we are left to consider whether the prohibition of these young people from the simulation events on the ground of safety constitutes a breach of our moral code as a society. We will be solely focused on the concept of fairness. Page 112. Do you know why we have laws that define fair treatment to those who have historically not been treated as equals? Because fair is not a universal objective term. Fair means different things from different people, and some people might say it's fair to treat disabled people unequally because disabled people are lesser in some way, and so what is fair to them is less than an able-bodied person. This is why we have laws that specify things. But fine, apparently, the superhero community doesn't want laws protecting the disabled, but is happy to individually eke out fairness if they think it's deserved. The board then goes through each of the kids, asking about their power, disability, and how their disability affects their power. When it gets to Henry, he happily states his disability doesn't limit his powers at all. I can do anything that any other mind reader can do. Except walk, Tucker said patronizingly, not missing a beat. Who cares if I can walk or not? Henry said sharply in retort, losing his cool a little bit, if you ask me. Well, I do, young man, the old man said, his words dripping with sarcasm. I'm concerned about the event of danger wherein you are unable to escape in time due to your mobility constraints. I am concerned only with the matter of your safety and the safety of those around you. I'm faster in this wheelchair than most humans using just their legs, my friend shot back quietly, but plenty loud enough to have been heard. Tucker didn't seem swayed in the least. And what if the enemy lies at the end of a dirt road or the beach? How will you reach him to read his thoughts, Mr. Gardner? Page 114. Somehow, the room of citizens does not immediately drown Tucker out in booing. Can you imagine witnessing a grown man negging a young disabled boy like this, just on stage? Henry grows angry, but Philip has an idea and persuades Tucker to let him demonstrate his new magic sight. He proves that with Henry's help, he can see and use telekinesis on objects he couldn't before. But in trying to show up, he accidentally bonks one of the school members on the head. So he and Henry are both kicked out. The meeting continues, though the boys feel hopeless about it. They wait for a while until they hear sudden cheering, and they learn that the team is going to be allowed into the SuperSim after all. Not because they proved it was unfair or ableist, not because of their dedication or determination. No, the day is saved by Mrs. Crouch. And it's saved appallingly, as is her style. One by one, she named every single school board member, followed by some specific story or fact that cast a new meaning on the hearing. For Alton Babish, she recounted his own misadventures as a Free Point High student, during which time he was suspended no less than 3 occasions for blatant misuse of powers. One boy had ended up with a broken arm. Bentley said Babish turned bright red and tried to bury his face behind his hand. Cynthia Yearling was a board member whose current secretary was a disabled person named Sue Reed. Sue was a paraplegic, but was blessed with the kind of advanced mind for mathematics that would make Bentley look dumb, and Mrs. Crouch told the whole crowd all about it. Bob Werner was the oldest member of the board, having served 30 years, and one of his 5 grandchildren was a disabled hero who served in a field support role with the Custodians operation in Chicago. He'd won many medals and commendations. On and on she went, rattling off a list of apparent hypocrisies among the board members. Each one had either gotten into trouble after an accident with their powers, as I had just done, or had some kind of connection to the disabled hero community. For Tucker, her story was truly a shocker, something only a person with intimate knowledge of a person would know. Octavius Tucker was himself a disabled person. He had scoliosis, and always had, and had kept it a secret most of his life. Page 123. Pointing out how anyone can wind up in an accident, that anyone can be reckless as a kid and make mistakes, that's a fair call. It highlights that disabled kids are being specifically punished for actions their peers wouldn't be. Sure, but the invocation of knowing a disabled person is not. Publicly disclosing someone's disability to make a point is not. And then Crouch gives her reasoning, which is worse. You might think my aim is to discredit you, or to make you look bad and lose face, but the opposite is true. I am extremely proud of each and every one of you and think you are all model citizens in this society of heroes. Whatever your demons were in your youth, you've risen above them and gone on to successful careers, making valuable contributions to this fine city. And those of you with connections to disabled individuals prove your heart's true nature every day simply by having those relationships. In fact, it is my love and respect for you which has led me to speak here today. Barring these children from competing in the simulation, while many of you employ disabled individuals of power, is the very definition of incongruous. If a disabled hero can serve in a field support role or as president of the school board, then how can we justify, as a community, telling these kids they can't compete? Page 124. Apparently, the mere act of tolerating a disabled person's presence proves someone's beautiful, true heart's nature. One example is someone's super genius secretary. Who says she's being treated well as opposed to just hired because she's useful? It's also true her point here is entirely irrelevant, because every example she gives aligns with the school board's viewpoint. The school thinks it's too dangerous for disabled people to fight crime in the field. The implication is that the only future for them is in field support. Every disabled hero that Crouch mentions is in support. It's not incongruous at all because a disabled-powered person being employed to help the able-bodied is exactly what the school board wants to happen. And she ends it with yet another inaccurate point. The choice is simple. You either believe in them, that they can become productive members of hero society, or you're just humoring them. And that would just be cruel. Thank you. Page 124. It is absolutely maddening, and it works. The day is saved, not by disabled kids or the community waking up to their plight. It's saved by their condescending, non-disabled special ed teacher dishing out hot goss and utterly failing to address the actual reason for the ban. Inspiring. With the SuperSim back on, the team focuses on training. While in theory everyone is practicing their powers, the only progress we see is purely in regard to Henry providing Philip sight. Henry helps Philip see what his family looks like for the first time, and Philip's main takeaway is how deeply attractive they are. I had assumed my mother was pretty, though I'm not sure why. Maybe every boy believes his mother is pretty, but I was wrong. She was beautiful. I'm sure some of my early experiences of this new ability were colored by the euphoria of simply putting visuals to my life around me, but she looked like a knockout to me. An angel. Brunette, hair down to her shoulders with a small frame, and the kindest eyes you've ever seen. She was nothing like I had envisioned, and yet everything I expected her to be all at once. They all were. Dad wore glasses with tiny lenses and had short brown hair. His nose was a little on the large side, but he was otherwise what I would imagine most women would call handsome. Page 126. I understand the idea of being overwhelmed with sight and seeing your parents as, beautiful, but Philip's insistence on the hotness of his mom is just kind of weird. When he tells his parents about his new ability to see, his mother begins to cry, and we get this. She was so overcome with emotion in the moment that she could barely put a sentence together between sobs of joy. I caught the word proud and the word love, and I'm fairly certain she mentioned how happy she was for me that I could finally see. Page 127. Sure, it's emotional for your blind son to gain vision and see for the first time, but proud? Happy that he's finally able to see? It sounds more like his mother is relieved that he's no longer disabled more than anything else, so proud that he finally overcame that horrible affliction to come join the normal world at last. Like, okay, it's normal to be emotional about something like this, like someone getting hearing aids for the first time. You might be excited to introduce them to sounds and experiences previously closed off to them, but you wouldn't say you were proud they could finally hear. That implies that being unable to hear is something to not be proud of. In Philip's case, too, his vision is temporary and entirely reliant on Henry. He'll go back to being blind in like an hour. Will his mother love him less then? His adventures of sight continue regarding his friends. We never learn what any of them look like except Henry. And Henry gets this line, and there are so many quotes in this book because there's no other way I can show you this book. Oh, God. Or the fact that Henry was black-skinned. Some things just never occur to you when you're blind. Race had never even been a consideration for me. It's easy to be colorblind when you're also regular blind. Page 128. Philip, you can't be saying that, Philip. As a kid who is 12, who grew up in New York City, as much as Philip may be blind, it's impossible he doesn't know something of race as a concept. Enough to know the word black, or had brown skin. Now, I read the book initially as a physical copy, and I have been using an ebook for faster referencing. The book has actually fixed this line, saying Henry was black instead. There's a few errors and other changes I've been citing from the book because of this, and double-checking quotes. Both versions, though, have the same front copyright information. There's no indication of, like, version 2 or anything. They both just say published 2015, very minimal front text. I was torn on including this since-edited excerpt, but it is astonishing that it had to be edited in the first place. That somebody okayed black-skinned the first time and only thought better after the book was published. The first day of the SuperSim arrives. Evidently, it's spread across 3 days with weeks and months between them for no particular reason. Philip's team decides to name themselves the Ables, because of course they do. It seems obvious why this book and their team are called the Ables. It's a very direct reference to them being disabled. It's so cliche that it's just like, we're not disabled, we're abled. People think... It's very basic. But they're actually named after the historic superhero team who stopped the evil Elben, who weren't disabled. So the linguistic link to disability is actually a full misnomer. The Ables as a team has no reference and as a title to the fact that they are disabled. The Ables teleport around the city looking for crimes to stop, but only head towards obvious screams and arrive late each time. They wind up frustrated. They then hear strange sounds coming from the library, one of the few buildings in town which is explicitly off limits. They decide to check it out, though, in case there's a real crime going on. Inside, they wander around until the lights suddenly go out. Philip can't tell the difference between Henry stopping his vision sharing versus darkness, even though, as we've covered, they're two very different things. They encounter the person who broke in, a man in a tweed suit and tweed hat, smoking a pipe and carrying a cane. This is the main villain of the book, and you can practically hear the casting call describing his mysterious gentleman shtick. He introduces himself as Mr. Finch, and then teleports the kids to Cleveland. When they return, he's gone, and there's no evidence of the break-in. Everyone gets in trouble for going out of bounds and potentially lying about Finch's existence. They decide, though, to further investigate on their own, starting with exploring the library to figure out what he was looking for. At one point, Philip looks at a sign and immediately reads that it says archives, despite almost certainly not knowing how to read. In fact, later in the book, the other blind character makes a point of noting that he can't read printed text even with borrowed vision. Like so many things, it's a skill he could have learned, practiced since gaining sight. Instead, it just feels like Jeremy wasn't thinking. They discover there's a no-power zone at the floor of the archive room. Like many discoveries, it hinges specifically on Philip's ability to see and notice things visually. There's actually a number of times that Philip is able to see a clue in order to progress the story. Here, Philip has noticed that his vision leaves when Henry is close to the floor. But it's still a clue that is defined by Philip having sight in the first place. If Philip had remained blind the entire book, and the plot stayed as is, the plot would never have progressed, and Philip would never get to be a hero. The Finch plot is the main story, but it's spread out over many months with plenty of just non-plot asides. His plan is unsurprisingly nonsensical. Like, we're gonna get there. Almost all of his decisions make no sense in hindsight. They're just inexplicable. We just sort of wait for them to happen. So now it's Halloween. Halloween is Philip's favorite holiday, but he is oddly fixated on costumes in particular. He says that he feels less disabled and more hidden when in a costume, but it's not like dressing up makes him less identifiably blind. He also is very particular about a costume being recognizable, even though, again, he's blind and would have very little metric of what that means, but apparently it's extremely important to him. Henry is going as a wheelchair rugby player, also called murder ball, that is, and it's because he saw a documentary. The sport is never actually named as wheelchair rugby or murder ball, but there is a 2005 documentary called Murder Ball that I assume Jeremy had seen. It's cool to bring up such just a great sport, but it feels like a loss to not actually name it so that readers could look into it. Donnie, meanwhile, is dressed in a white leisure suit with a blue button-up, an outfit his parents chose, which Philip doesn't recognize. I felt immediate dread, as I did recognize it. It was a true horror reading in my experience where I was like, Donnie was dressed up in a white leisure suit with a blue button-up. I don't know what it was. And I was thinking to myself, I have a horrible idea that I know exactly what to Google and I will see this exact outfit. And I was correct, because Donnie is dressed up as Forrest Gump. Gump's an example of a character with a vague learning disability and is an obvious source for how Donnie is written. Donnie turning out to have super speed and being a good runner in general suddenly feels like a reference to Gump rather than an attempt to make Donnie a unique person. Philip debates picking a costume based on a famous blind person or character, but decides not to. And here's his reasoning. In the end, I decided my blindness didn't need to be reflected in my choice of costume. After all, I had recently gained the gift of sight, at least on certain occasions. Maybe wearing a blind man's costume wouldn't really be a very accurate reflection anymore anyway. So I dressed up in the same costume I did every year, Batman. Even though I knew that choice would keep my costume from being truly unique, there were at least another 30 kids out in Freepoint that night dressed as the Caped Crusader, I had always felt a connection with the character. Page 166. So apparently, Philip no longer identifies as blind, a very inspiring message for blind people everywhere. Despite the heavy emphasis on Philip struggling with picking a costume, he ends up as Batman, which he apparently does every single year. His feeling of connection to Batman also mystifies me. I have only a very passing knowledge of Batman, but he is famously an angsty billionaire orphan raised by a butler. And Philip, you're a middle-aged kid with a loving family and a normal life. I'm not sure what he's connecting to with Batman. They go trick-or-treating, but run into Finch. He has a bunch of generic cloaked followers digging something up in a field. He confronts the kids and begins to talk about Elben and the prophecy of his return, and he notes that Freepoint itself is a sacred place for Elben worshippers. You see, long before America existed, indeed, long before America was even discovered, this place, this city, this very spot was central to our people, your people. Freepoint was his home. It wasn't called Freepoint then, of course, but long before your parents gentrified this place into a hero's town, it was home to a darker power. Page 176. This and why he's digging a hole in the ground in the first place are never expanded upon. Like most of the Elben lore, it's a bunch of kind of directionist details with odd implications. Before America was even discovered, there were people who lived here. Early humans migrated to the American continents like an estimated 21,000 years ago. We don't have a time period for Elben besides before biblical times, and the only explanation for this world building is that Elben would have belonged to an indigenous population, I guess? The "your people" response seems to tie all superheroes to Elben, implying maybe superpowers first came into existence from here. The book does note superpowered DNA is so different from regular DNA they might as well be considered different species. So maybe a meteor with alien DNA struck down here long ago. It's not explained, but I think that might be what's going on. It's just a strange move to tie your villain and plot to ancient America while treating the place as an undiscovered wasteland holding an evil power. Was Elben born here? Maybe. That's all we know. It's never going to be explained. Finch explains that the believers are certain Elben has already been reborn, and only needs to awaken to his powers. He threatens the kids to keep quiet, but Henry just mocks him, causing Finch to make an over-the-top display of his powers. He has the ability to absorb other people's powers and then use them for a few hours afterwards, and he uses this to terrorize them. Philip has this emergency call button that he keeps with him in his pocket, and that sends out an alert to his mother, who has the power of teleportation. She arrives to rescue them, but Finch immediately traps them in an NPZ and strikes Philip's mom down, and then he just departs. His mother appears dead, but it turns out that she is in a deep psychic coma. Only Finch can release her from it. This gives Philip something to angst over, but life just kind of continues on. Bentley places thousands of cameras across town so the Abels can better find crime next SuperSim, and Donnie is confirmed at last to have super speed. The team returns to investigate the library. The long period between discovering this NPC below the floor and actually looking into it, unexplainable. It's clear that Finch is keeping Philip's mother in a coma as leverage, but he barely bats an eye as they continue to poke into his secrets. They find this hidden secret room with the NPC and teleport into it. Inside is a huge book, a group photo of some of the cultists, and Finch, just waiting for them. He forces Philip to take the book, and raves about Elben's prophecy some more. He doesn't add any new information, he makes a couple vague references that never come into play, and then he leaves again. The bully Chad, who was briefly suspended in a scene I skipped over, he returns to school at this point. He apologizes as he'd punched Philip, and as a result, his dad had sent him off to a military boot camp as punishment. It turns out that Chad's father is very abusive, something which absolutely blows Philip's mind. I have to admit, an abusive father is so far from the reality I personally had known that it was hard to get my head around. Page 207. There's something to be said that people often fail to notice abuse because of their lack of knowledge or an assumption of what it looks like. But Philip, a boy who loves comics, TV, movies, he seems boggled by the notion a bully like Chad might be taking out anger as a result of an abusive home life, like that isn't an extremely common trope and idea. At boot camp, Chad lost an arm in an accident. Again, in the most rote Dar Man after school special way, Chad then experienced ableism and bullying and has returned to school reformed. Philip is shocked by the apology, but he feels sympathy, though his friends still distrust Chad. Philip also then has a long talk with his father about forgiveness in light of Chad's change. His father explains the importance of forgiveness and change and tells a story. His father, Philip's grandfather, was betrayed by his grandfather's best friend. They were confronting a villain when the friend suddenly took the villain's side. His grandfather was hit in the face by a lightning bolt and just fell hundreds of feet down to his death. Why this happened is not explained, but the grandfather's friend felt immense regret and turned himself in. After time in jail, he led a totally crime-free life. In fact, he's their neighbor, Mr. Charles, the quiet neighbor that they have over for dinner every week. Chad is added to the team as the final member. His power is invisibility, something which has not been brought up until now. The kids further investigate Finch and Elben, with the narrative repeatedly saying that they were doing exactly what Finch wanted them to do. It sounds ominous, but it means nothing. At the end of yet another chapter, yet another chapter of them blandly chatting with each other and poking around. They learn nothing that hasn't already been said, and in fact actively start complaining to each other about how little they've learned. At this point, it's like the kids are looking at me as the reader and just being like, wow, we're not learning anything. We're just kind of going back and forth having discussions about things that have already been said. And I'm sitting there nodding along like I'm having pizza with these kids too. Like, yes, this is horrible. Why is this in the book? At the second SuperSim, the Able split into two groups. Philip, Henry, and Chad confront a villain at the grocery store, a fireball-shooting man who has a hostage. Philip devises a plan. As always, he's not just the de facto leader, but also the primary plot mover, while his friends kind of just hang on and do whatever he suggests. He has to suggest to Henry to read the villain's mind, and tells Chad to get it, turn invisible, and go get a fire extinguisher. They're going to distract the bad guy, and Chad is going to sneak up behind him and save the hostage. The distraction, though, that Philip chooses is arson. Spotting some parked cars, he finds a truck with a full gas container and begins to pour it out on the ground. Then, when the villain next throws a fireball, Philip uses his telekinesis to redirect it and explodes 3 cars. These later turn out to not be special prop cars, but literally just people's vehicles parked at the grocery store. But the SuperSim villain doesn't stop his act. He just continues pretending to be a villain. Chad fails to show up to save the hostage, and Philip calls in Donnie to come across town to help, because he can just run there instantly. Donnie arrives in a burst of light, but just in front of the parking lot, he trips. Specifically on an invisible, unconscious Chad, who is apparently lying in the middle of the road right where Donnie is about to come in. His momentum, though, is so immense that he bounces across the pavement, collides full speed into the villain and hostage, and all 3 of them are horrifically injured. He plowed directly into the SuperSim villain, sending the man and his hostage flying into the air as though a grenade had exploded nearby. The sound of the impact was sickening. When it was all over, they found the fireballer on the roof of a house 3 blocks over. It took them an hour more to find the woman hostage in a tree on 5th Street. Donnie himself had careened straight down the road like a rock skipping over a smooth lake. He came to a stop 7 blocks away in a pile of clothing, blood, flesh, and blacktop. It's an undeniable miracle that he didn't die. The doctors said he had more broken bones than unbroken ones. Page 253 to 254. Donnie is, the far worse off, requiring a full body cast after 12-hour surgery and heavy skin grafting. The school board immediately forces the Ables to disband, reaffirming the ban on disabled participants in the SuperSim. While all the Ables are in trouble, the majority of the town's anger is on Donnie. The entire town had turned on Donnie as though he was some kind of Frankenstein monster, something to fear instead of nurture. The locals had branded him a menace, and there was even early talk of shipping him off to some kind of mental hospital. Thankfully, that had died down within a few days, but the whispers continued. Page 256. This happens right after the accident, when Donnie is said to be clinging on to life in the ICU. The superhero community hates disabled people so much that they will look at a dying 15-year-old and try to exile him. It's very obvious what happened here was an accident. Chad was invisible and unconscious on the road. There's too many factors involved in what happened to lay blame on anyone, but anybody moving at top speed and tripping would have devastating consequences like this. But it's Donnie, so... Later, the town bands together to successfully kick him permanently out of school, even though at the time, he's again still in the hospital recovering. Several parents in town had led a charge to get Donnie ruled ineligible for regular schooling. They reasoned that his brute strength and newly discovered super speed, along with his inability to truly control either, was a danger to the other kids, and they'd successfully convinced the school board to agree. Page 267. The level of normalized hatred for a child with a learning disability is just astonishing, and almost never challenged. Great that they didn't exile him, but everyone was cool with him being banned from school? I suppose superheroes don't obey American law, so the right to education isn't protected, and apparently no one thinks it should be. Like the segregation of every disabled kid to special ed, the cast simply accepts this as unfair but unavoidable. Later, it's mentioned that the town is then going to try and ban all children with Down syndrome from attending school in the future. Inspiring stuff. While visiting Donnie at the hospital, Philip encounters Finch once more. They argue about good and evil in a boring way for a while before Finch reveals that he believes Philip is Elben reincarnated. He gives the prophecy, and this is the text. He shall return again, an outcast, one who is not like us, who does not see the world as we do, and he shall have all abilities. Where once he used his gifts for death and destruction, his second life shall see them used for life and protection. This one shall not know of his true depth of power until he suffers great loss and injury, and he alone stands as the last protector between the world and a great power. Only then shall he truly see. Only then shall he embrace his true purpose. Page 314. Finch's insistence that Philip is Elben has some immediate problems on many different levels. For one, Finch keeps asking Philip to join him, and while he rejects the label of evil, Finch's plans seem to involve revealing superheroes to the general population and then installing them as the superior class of human. This is obviously evil. The prophecy explicitly notes that unlike last time, Elben isn't going to take over the world and do bad stuff, he's going to be a hero. Why does Finch think this new Elben would ever take his fascist side? The rest of it is very vague, though Finch insists that it matches Philip exactly. It also turns out that the Big Book of Elben has mathematical calculations from the 7th century which prove Elben statistically has been reborn and will be in Freepoint this year. Something Bentley agrees is scientifically plausible and 99.9% true. Philip rejects Finch's offer to join him repeatedly, and then secretly presses his emergency call button. His mother's in a coma, of course, but one of her co-workers shows up with his father to try and stop Finch. Finch, being a mind reader, sees this coming. He drops an NPC and then breaks the coma link with Philip's mother, killing her. When Philip's mother entered the coma, he grieved for a very long time, and there's a whole chapter all about his Christmas grieving, and now he gets to do it again. It feels entirely like the book has killed his mother twice, both times purely as motivation for the men around her. It's implied and later confirmed that Finch is doing this to recreate the prophecy, forcing Philip into a great loss as a way to awaken his powers. Prophecies do not typically work by being forced to come true, and famously there's probably more stories where trying such a thing causes the opposite results, defying fate and all, except Finch just remains convinced that this will work, no matter how many times it fails. Philip is depressed, angry, and grieving his mother. He misses school for 5 weeks, and when he returns, he notes he's become a worse person because of his depression. He allows people to cater to him, he coasts on his schoolwork, and he just becomes lazy. It sounds a lot like he's depressed because he's 12 and his mom was just murdered by a man who thinks he's evil Jesus, and it's been barely over a month. But, at this point, our favorite character, Mrs. Crouch, shows up, and Mrs. Crouch is here to save the day, as she always does. I was a victim of extraordinary hardship. The world had battered and bruised me, cutting me down and leaving me broken. The least it could do was even things out with a little privilege, right? Out of everyone in my life, only Mrs. Crouch had the courage to tell it like it was. You've milked this special attention for all it's worth, and if you're not careful, you're going to turn into a horrible human being. You're not the only kid who has ever suffered a tragedy, Philip. It happens every day, all around the world. What you have to decide is whether you're going to let your depression define you, or if you're going to rise above it. I'm so sorry you lost your mother. I really am. I cannot imagine how hard it's been for you, and I wouldn't even dare to try. But you've let the bitterness and sadness grip you for far too long. Look at Chad. Look at Donnie. Look at the rest of your friends. Henry's in a wheelchair. Bentley will never be able to walk properly. Poor Darla can't see or hear. What's your point? My point is that people suffer, she continued. It stinks, it's not fair, but it happens. And there are only two kinds of people in this world, Mr. Salinger. People who rise above that suffering and people who let it define them. I just don't want to see you become the latter. Page 268. So it's been 5 weeks. It's been barely over a month since his mother was murdered. Mrs. Crouch is clearly supposed to be a mentor figure, but she is instead an absolute nightmare. What kind of lesson is this? If you stay depressed, you'll become a monster, so get over it. Inspiring. Further horrible is the implication presented here, which is not one refuted by the book. To be disabled is to innately suffer. If you're disabled and suffering, you have two choices. Overcome your difficulties to become a good person, or fail and be a horrible person who is defined by disability. She lists his friends as examples of people suffering. They're normal kids who simply have disabilities. She calls out Henry being in a wheelchair and Bentley being able to walk properly as part of this. Do you know what the correct response is to the idea that Bentley might not ever be able to walk without the use of a cane? Do you know what the proper response is to such a statement? So what? Is it suffering to not be able to walk? Or is it suffering to live in a world where people who can't walk are discriminated against and ignored? The people who care that Bentley can't walk an even gait because of his cerebral palsy are not people we should listen to. Disability has long been seen as a suffering thing. I mean, see half of the depictions of characters in wheelchairs, and how often they're defined as being trapped in the chair. But do you know what a wheelchair is? It's freedom. Wheelchairs offer independence and movement to people who can't move without them. It's only trapping and suffering from the perspective that not being in a wheelchair but being able to walk around able-bodied is the superior way to be. None of this invalidates the fact that disability can be extremely difficult, but the Ables only examines it from an able-bodied viewpoint, emphasis on what the disabled kids lack more than anything else. Many disabilities cause chronic pain and illness. Many people are unable to take part in activities they'd like to. Many disabilities come with constant reminders that their body and/or their mind doesn't fit the societal norm. Disabled people might suffer, resent their disability, find it hard to adapt, but their lives are not defined purely by that struggle. Nor is it something to rise above and not be defined by, because that isn't possible for the majority of people with disabilities. Like, no, someone who isn't deaf isn't purely defined by their deafness. Someone who is deaf isn't purely defined by their deafness, but their deafness is still going to be a major factor in their life. If someone does feel their disability has such a significant impact on their life, they choose to actively define themselves by it, then that is their choice. It's rather like person first and disability first language. Most of the time we use person first language, where we say a person with autism, for example, but also some people may say, or in some contexts say, an autistic person, where you are putting the label of the disability first. Generally speaking, you listen to what a person prefers to use, obviously, and generally we use person first language, but if somebody is choosing to use disability first language, that is their right. And who cares? I mean, people clearly do care. But why does acknowledging and accepting the difficulties of being disabled condemn you to being a horrible person? Philip's internal image of himself as a victim demanding privilege might offer a clue. Crouch is telling him he's not special for suffering. The implication that the true sin here, then, is the idea of victimhood, that someone who is in pain must not let that pain define them, or else they'll become a bad person. And sure, at a certain point, someone might be taking advantage of charity or wallowing rather than taking steps forward, but again, his mom just died. Beyond the way that Crouch winds up linking disability to suffering, she's also just doing a horrible job on the depression front. Mental illness and disability are close buddies, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Many mental illnesses can be disabling, and many of them are also lifelong conditions. I've had chronic depression since I was much younger than Philip. You don't treat depression by telling someone to get over it or else they'll be a bad person. They probably already think that. Yet Crouch is apparently telling it like it is, reinforcing any part of her words here as correct, helpful, or goddamn inspiring. And after this conversation, Philip stops being depressed. It never comes up again. On the final SuperSim day, the Ables are still banned from participating. They take out their frustration by teleporting to Central Park in New York and stopping random crimes that they encounter. They notice that Freepoint is under attack for real, though, as Finch and his goons capture and kill townsfolk. Obviously, it's time for the kids to save the day. This was always where the plot was going. As much as there's a competition, the most obvious arc with a competition plot like this is exactly, oh, maybe we can't win the competition, but when a real evil comes along, we'll be the unexpected heroes. And so, this is where it was always going, and it was extremely predictable. So, what happens is Finch burns a message onto a school lawn telling Philip that it's time, and Philip is oddly extremely confused as to why Finch wants him, despite Finch explicitly telling him multiple times the whole Elben thing. James, Henry, and Philip do some teleport scouting, and when they return to Central Park, the rest of the group is inexplicably being arrested and led into a police van. Rather than just teleport them out, Freddy grows giant for the first time in the book, making a public spectacle before they teleport away. This is the one thing he does in the course of the book of any note. I mean, he barely has any lines in the book. This is the one time he uses his power. He uses power like twice to no effect either. Freddy. They sneak up to the school. Past, I am slightly getting lost in this horrendous climax. It's because the action is all over the place, and it's just constantly jumping around. So, Freddy breaks them out of a police van. It doesn't matter. Them being put in the police van in the first place is sort of a non sequitur. They all teleport back to Freepoint, away from New York. They split into teams, with one group going to call up another superhero town for help from a special emergency phone. The other team is going to try and infiltrate the high school, where Finch is storing the majority of powered people. Bentley, James, and Freddy are captured immediately by the bad guys, which we hear over a phone call, leaving Chad, Henry, and Philip alone. They sneak up to the school past Finch, but Chad trips and they are revealed. Finch taunts them, revealing he's been using their SuperSim camera network the whole time to execute his plan. He continues to insist that Philip is Elben and needs to embrace his true power and join Finch. Step 2 of his plan, never clear. His goal to force the prophecy to come true is by causing lots of tragedy around Philip. He does seem, though, unaware that killing someone's mother is perhaps the worst way to make them sympathetic towards you. He further taunts them by revealing that Chad has been a traitor the whole time. Chad willingly lost his arm by Finch's order, becoming disabled so he could fit into the Ables and join them as a spy. There is no answer on why he did this. Philip, however, reveals to Finch and the reader that he already knew that Chad was a traitor. Philip always doubted that bullies could become better people, but he was convinced by the fact that Chad had lost an arm. But then they realized that Chad was bugged, and Henry remembered that he could read minds and found Chad's was suspiciously avoidant, as if trying to avoid thinking of certain things. The linchpin, though, is silly, as one time when stopping criminals in Central Park, Chad dove onto the ground while invisible and caused a mugger to trip. Philip realized that this is what he must have done with Donnie, and that's kind of ridiculous. Like, was he lying on ground the whole time, knowing somehow that Philip would call for Donnie as backup when that was an improvised move? How did he know the exact route and angle that Donnie would take? How could he have dove in front in time when Donnie runs at super speed if it's something where he jumped in the exact moment he saw him coming? Yet this is their biggest clue. It's a frustrating twist, too, because it undermines the only scene in the book that had, like, any lesson to it. I would almost say the only scene in the book that was any good, except I think that might be too high of praise. Like, I was fine with the cliche mean kid joining the good side, and the dad's lesson about people being able to change was kind of nice. But no, it turns out that's impossible and Chad just sucks. Philip now has the upper hand. The other half of their team being captured was also a lie that they told Chad, so he'd just pass it on to Finch. And the others are actually infiltrating the school right now to help rescue the prisoners. they also had time to warn Mr. Charles, the guy who killed his grandfather, to come over to the school and use his NPC powers against Finch. Mr. Charles then shows up and reveals that he was once in the same cult as Finch, but that back in the day, it was just a college secret society not taking the Elben stuff that seriously. He also notes that Finch isn't who he claims to be, and it's revealed that Finch is actually Philip's assumed dead grandfather, Thomas. Apparently, when he was blasted in the face by lightning and fell off a roof to his death, he didn't actually die. But his family decided he was dead without ever retrieving his body, and forgot about his ability, I guess, to borrow powers and how that might have protected him. This is why he's especially so obsessed with Philip being Elben, because that's his grandson. Philip shouts that if Finch wanted Philip to be on his side, he could have just been his goddamn grandfather, rather than killing his own daughter-in-law to vaguely force a prophecy. Mr. Charles has an NPC on Finch, but Finch's men also have guns. As they ready to fire, Philip is able to use his powers to a heightened effect and control all of their guns at once, tossing them onto the roof. He then picks Finch up and slams him into a wall of his telekinesis, just several times repeatedly in his anger. But Henry then begs him to stop, and he does. While this is going on, Chad sneaks up behind Mr. Charles and shoots him in the head, killing him. Chad is never mentioned again. One of Finch's minions then comes over to heal him with powers, and he gets back up to continue his nonsensical villain plotting. He reveals he's planted 3 bombs in the school of progressing intensity. Once he hits the switch, all 3 will go off in a short window of time. The final of these bombs is a 3-ton nuclear bomb. He says if this doesn't awaken Philip's powers, it'll kill him, and that's fine, which is entirely against everything he's ever said about his beliefs and his wants. This is sort of like a Christian waiting for the second coming and being so annoyed that Jesus doesn't like them, they decide to murder him. And it is kind of funny, but don't you think your followers might have a problem with this? Apparently not. They're not characters. They don't really get to do anything or be people. They're just kind of generic minions. Finch sets off the bomb right as the other kids free the basement prisoners. They're helpless to stop the explosions, though, and as the bombs begin to go off in increasing intensity and the nuke is about to go off, everyone's in this field here, it's the end. Philip sees a bright light flash across the field, and it's Donnie, using his super speed. He saves every single person by running them across town to safety one by one. The entire climax, Philip has sight. It's kind of comedic. Henry sometimes loses his connection, but Finch then immediately takes over providing it. The two alternate who is giving vision at various times, ensuring Philip can always see what is going on. Even when Finch teleports away and Henry is knocked unconscious, Philip mysteriously can still see Donnie save the day. One way to get away with giving your blind character vision for the majority of your book would be to ensure that he lacks it at the climax. It's the big showdown, it's time for him to be a true hero, and he's able to save the day while still being disabled, proving that heroism doesn't rely on being able-bodied. Maybe him being blind could have played into the finale at all, like having to fight off some bad guys in a pitch-black room. They're unused to being unable to see, but he isn't. But no, for Philip, to be a hero and to be blind at the same time is impossible. As the bombs explode and Donnie saves the day, it's revealed that Donnie is Elben reborn, of course. The prophesized great loss and tragedy, I guess, is just being despised by everyone in town. As the nuke explodes, Donnie flies into it, becoming a black hole and disappearing, having saved the day. There's a suggestion maybe he might have survived because who knows what a black hole is, but yeah, he's probably dead. Awesome. There's room for this to be good, I guess, as this book is full of constant wrong turns with easy fixes. Like, imagine if Donnie had lived. Considering how the town treated him when they thought he only had one superpower, they'd probably get even worse about him having them all. A point could be made about the villainization of the disabled and the tendency to view them as uncontrollable dangers, points the book almost makes without really being aware of it. Instead, Donnie saves everyone and kills himself, and we don't have to think any harder on the subject. The town, after having been saved by Donnie from both death and radiation poisoning, Still hates his guts. The town erected a monument in Donnie's honor, but only because Bentley harassed the city council with legal filings to get them to do it. Left to their own, I don't know that they would have done anything. Everyone knew it had been Donnie who saved the day, but it was a complicated issue. I guess it was just hard for some people to admit that their salvation had come from a kid like Donnie, especially the ones who had been the most unspoken against him earlier. There were a lot of monuments there, some big, some small. Donnie's wasn't a statue or anything like that, just a nice plaque noting his contribution to the city's survival. We were the disabled kids they found acceptable to call heroes, while Donnie was the one they preferred to remember a little differently. Local history would probably end up glossing over Donnie's role in the battle. It felt wrong, almost, but we were definitely glad to no longer be complete outcasts. Now everyone loved us. Page 357. The message again and again in this book is an acceptance of exceptionalism rather than of disability. The kids constantly accept the low place society gives them with no effort to fight the majority of injustice obvious in society. They don't press for more than a bare minimum, and even then I wouldn't even call it a bare minimum. It's okay Donnie, who died saving the town from a nuke, only gets a vague plaque. They know it's because of ableism, but apparently not the kind worth fighting. The book quickly wraps up, and the kids just move swiftly on. Conclusion. I can't believe a book like this exists. You would think I'd be used to books like this after Save the Pearls and Precious Blood, but it's still just astonishing to witness in real time. A novel about disability that just hates the disabled. A blind protagonist who wasn't researched and whose writer was too afraid of the effort involved that he just gains perfect eyesight beginning very early in the plot. The writing is dull, it feels more like a script than a novel, there's constant errors and inconsistencies. Most of the characters blink in and out of existence as the plot demands, while the women disappear entirely. The comedy is overplayed and unfunny. It's hard to tell when something is a joke or not. Occasionally there's scenes that simply last 2 or 3 pages where I think it's meant to be comedic, and it isn't. The plot is as cliché as it gets, while failing to deliver any of its choreographed beats effectively. No one has a character arc, or a character. Jeremy CinemaSins puts a lot of emphasis on how hard he worked on these books in interviews I've read, saying in the Tam magazine interview that he spent a mind-blowing amount of hours on it, and that it took him close to 20 rewrites. It is incredible how much work he was doing, specifically how little of it was dedicated to expanding his worldview on the topics he was choosing to write about. He says he took over 8 years working on the Ables in one form or another. How hard would it have been, in the course of nearly a decade, to talk to a single person with Down syndrome about their experiences? A character like Donnie should not exist. He is so obviously only stereotypes and false ideas of what someone with a learning disability might be, so unconnected to Down syndrome as much as the book insists that he is the representation of what it is like. I think Jeremy CinemaSins actively should, donate a lot of money to some people with Down syndrome as an apology for writing this. He says he worked so hard on this book. There's an editor listed. There's collaborators who read this book as he worked on it. And they all thought the way that Donnie was written was okay. There is a good intention here about writing a book about disabled superheroes saving the day despite society's expectations. This is not a new idea or story, but this drastic a failure of it is. So here's a radical statement to close us out. Disabled children deserve better. Honestly, everybody does.